What's the most ridiculous thing you've ever been accused of? It all started after our school banned students from sharing money with each other because they said it promoted inequality and bullying. They installed cameras at every lunch table and had monitors watching. At first, we all thought it was just another stupid rule they'd forget about after a week. But after someone got suspended for giving their friend lunch money, we knew they were serious. Soon, SIDS started bartering because technically goods weren't money. You'd see people trading homework help for chips or swapping phone chargers for pizza slices. But the school caught on to the bartering system after 2 months and banned that too. Now if you forgot your lunch or didn't have money in your account, you just went hungry. Teachers would walk through the cafeteria like guards, watching for any suspicious food sharing or unauthorized sandwich transfers. That's when I started noticing that my friend Haley wasn't eating lunch anymore, just sitting there with a water bottle pretending to read while everyone else ate. After 3 days of this, I cornered her after chemistry and made her tell me what was happening. Her dad had been laid off from the factory, and her mom's cleaning business had lost its biggest contract, so they told her she needed to skip lunch to save money. The next day I brought extra food from home and tried to casually leave it near her, but she pushed it back because she knew we'd both get suspended if anyone saw. I watched her sit there starving while I ate my sandwich, feeling like the world's worst friend because I couldn't even share my food without risking both our academic futures. After a week of watching her get thinner and more exhausted, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to just give her cash outside school so she could load her lunch account without anyone knowing. We met by the loading dock before first period where there weren't supposed to be cameras, and I handed her $60 to cover the next 2 weeks. She started crying and tried to refuse it, but I told her it wasn't charity because she'd helped me pass algebra last year when I was failing. We thought we were being careful, but neither of us noticed the hall monitor who'd followed Haley after seeing her leave the building during homeroom. 20 minutes later, I got called to the principal's office over the intercom in the middle of English class. Haley was already there, sitting in a chair with tears streaming down her face, while the principal stood behind his desk with his arms crossed like he'd caught us selling drugs. "Explain to me why you were paying Haley $60 in a hidden location this morning," the principal said, leaning forward with this disgusting smirk on his face. I told him about Haley and her parents, but he just shook his head like I was insulting his intelligence. He said nobody just gives someone $60 without expecting something in return, especially not a teenage boy giving money to a teenage girl in a secret meeting spot. Haley started sobbing harder as she realized what he was implying, and I felt my whole body go cold with rage and disbelief. "I won't have prostitution happening at my school," the principal said, his voice dripping with false concern, while his eyes showed he was enjoying this power trip. Haley ran out crying while I stood there in complete shock that an adult had just accused us of intimacy work because I tried to buy my starving friend lunch. The principal picked up his phone and started dialing, saying he was calling both our parents and the school resource officer because this was now a criminal matter requiring full investigation. I could hear him telling whoever answered that he'd uncovered inappropriate financial transactions between students that suggested solicitation of sexual services. I could see him writing notes about calling CPS because obviously something must be wrong at home if teenagers were engaging in this kind of behavior. He looked up at me with this satisfied expression. "Your parents will be here within the hour, and we'll be conducting a full investigation, including checking your phone records and social media," he said, hanging up and pulling out forms that said Sexual Misconduct Incident Report at the top. I stood there staring at those forms while the principal kept writing, his pen scratching across the paper with this sick satisfaction on his face. The office door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall, and my parents rushed in, my mom's face redder than I'd ever seen it in my entire life. My dad's hands were shaking as he walked straight up to the principal's desk and leaned over it, asking what evidence he had for these disgusting accusations. The principal didn't even look up from his paperwork at first, just kept writing like my parents weren't even there. My mom grabbed the forms right out from under his pen and started reading them, her eyes getting wider with each word. The principal finally stood up and pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, opening it to show them the hall monitor's report about seeing us at the loading dock. He started explaining about inappropriate financial transactions between students and how $60 changing hands in a hidden location suggested something serious was happening. My mom cut him off before he could finish his sentence, telling him that giving lunch money to a hungry friend wasn't prostitution, and she couldn't believe she had to explain this to someone who was supposed to be an educator. The principal's face got this smug look as he pointed to specific parts of the report, highlighting how we met in secret and how I specifically gave her cash instead of just buying her food directly. My dad reached for the report, but the principal pulled it back, saying it was official school documentation that couldn't be handled by non-staff members. The office door opened again, and Haley's parents came in, her mom already crying before she even heard what was happening. Her dad's hands were clenched into fists at his sides as the principal started explaining his suspicions about their daughter. Haley's mom collapsed into a chair when she heard the word prostitution, sobbing so hard she couldn't even speak. Her dad asked the principal if he really thought their financial struggles meant their daughter was selling herself to classmates. The principal straightened his tie and said he had to investigate all suspicious activity to protect students from exploitation, especially when vulnerable students might be taken advantage of during difficult times. He kept using words like concerning patterns and red flags, while Haley's parents just stared at him in complete disbelief. My dad asked to see the actual evidence beyond one hall monitor's report about a 60-second conversation that happened before school. The principal admitted he didn't have recordings from the loading dock area, but insisted the circumstantial evidence was concerning enough to warrant a full investigation, including contacting law enforcement and child protective services. He pulled out more forms from his desk, spreading them across the surface like he was showing off some big case he'd cracked. The assistant principal, Cara Blevins, walked in carrying a coffee and stopped dead when she saw all the parents crowded around the desk. She set her coffee down carefully and asked what was happening, her eyes moving between the crying parents and the forms spread across the desk. The principal handed her the hall monitor's report, and she read it slowly, her eyebrows pulling together as she processed what she was seeing. She looked up at the principal and pointed out that the report only described two students talking briefly and exchanging something that looked like money, nothing that suggested anything inappropriate. The principal's jaw tightened as he explained his theory about teenage boys not giving girls money without expecting something in return. My mom demanded to know why he jumped straight to prostitution, instead of the obvious explanation that I was helping a friend whose family was struggling. The principal leaned back in his chair and said that in his 30 years of education, he'd learned that teenage boys don't just give girls $60 without expecting something in return, especially not in secret meetings before school. My dad lunged forward, and my mom had to grab his arm to hold him back, both of them shaking with rage at what this man was suggesting about their son. The door opened again, and Officer Dexter Ritter walked in wearing his uniform, looking uncomfortable as he took in the scene of crying parents and scattered paperwork. The principal immediately started explaining his suspicions to the officer, using official-sounding language about solicitation and inappropriate exchanges between minors. Officer Ritter pulled out a small notebook and asked me directly what happened, so I explained about Haley not eating for a week and how I couldn't stand watching her go hungry anymore. I told him about the stupid food-sharing ban and how I decided to give her money for her lunch account since we couldn't share food directly. He wrote everything down, nodding occasionally and asking follow-up questions about specific dates and times. Haley's mom finally found her voice and confirmed their family's financial situation, breaking down sobbing as she explained how they'd told Haley to skip lunch to save money because they couldn't afford to load her account. She talked about her husband losing his job and her cleaning contracts drying up, how they were barely keeping the lights on at home. Officer Ritter kept taking notes, but I could see his expression changing, looking more skeptical about the principal's theory with each detail the parents provided. The principal wasn't backing down, though, insisting that we needed to check both students' phones and social media accounts for evidence of solicitation or inappropriate communications. My parents immediately refused to hand over my phone without a warrant, and Haley's parents followed suit, her dad saying this witch hunt had gone far enough and they wouldn't let their daughter be violated any further by these baseless accusations. Officer Ritter closed his notebook and looked directly at the principal with this tired expression that made it clear he'd seen enough fake emergencies from schools. He told the principal that giving lunch money to a friend wasn't a crime, and there was zero evidence of anything illegal happening here. The principal's face turned red as he started arguing that they needed to investigate everything thoroughly to protect the students from potential exploitation. Officer Ritter shook his head and said he wasn't opening a criminal investigation based on one kid helping another kid eat lunch. The principal slammed his hand on the desk and insisted this was about student safety and proper protocols. Officer Ritter stood up and put his notebook away, making it clear he was done wasting his time on this nonsense. Cara Blevins stepped between them and suggested everyone take a 10-minute break to cool down before things got worse. The principal refused immediately, saying this needed to be documented today while the evidence was fresh. He pulled the sexual misconduct incident report back toward himself and started filling it out despite Officer Ritter telling him there was no basis for that form. His pen moved across the paper as he wrote both our names in the boxes marked involved parties, while everyone watched in disbelief. My dad pulled out his phone and started dialing, and within seconds he had his lawyer on speaker right there in the office. The lawyer's voice filled the room as he told the principal that filing a false report about minors could result in a defamation lawsuit that would cost him personally. The principal's hand stopped moving over the form, his pen hovering above the next box while he processed this threat. The lawyer kept talking, explaining how accusing children of prostitution without evidence was grounds for both civil and criminal charges against the principal himself. My dad held the phone closer to the principal's face, so he couldn't pretend not to hear every word being said. The door opened, and Haley walked back in with the school counselor who had her arm around Haley's shoulders. Haley couldn't look at anyone and kept wiping tears with a tissue the counselor had given her. Her parents immediately wrapped their arms around her, creating this protective wall between her and the principal. The counselor, whose name tag said Mrs. Foster, cleared her throat and stepped forward to address the room. She explained that she'd known both of us for 3 years, and this accusation was completely out of character for either student. She pulled out a folder and showed records of Haley tutoring multiple students, including me in algebra last year. The principal tried to interrupt, but Mrs. Foster kept going, showing documentation of our academic relationship and how Haley had helped dozens of students with math over the years. She pointed out that establishing a pattern of academic support made the prostitution accusation even more ridiculous and harmful. The principal shifted in his chair and changed tactics, saying that even if it wasn't prostitution, I still violated the school's no money sharing policy. My mom immediately pointed out that the exchange happened at the loading dock, which was technically off school property. She'd looked it up on her phone and showed everyone that the loading dock was past the property line, according to the county records. The principal argued that students were still under school authority when they were on their way to the school. My mom pulled up the actual policy on her phone and read the part that said it only applied to actions on the school grounds during school hours. The principal's face got redder as he realized his own policy didn't support his position. The door burst open, and Theodore Banks, the district superintendent, walked in looking like someone had dragged him out of an important meeting. Someone had called him about the situation, and he'd driven over immediately to handle this mess. He looked around the crowded office, taking in the crying student, angry parents, frustrated police officer, and the principal still holding that form. He asked the principal to explain why he'd escalated to prostitution accusations without any actual evidence beyond two students talking briefly. The principal straightened up and started his speech about taking all suspicious activity seriously in today's climate. The superintendent's face showed exhaustion as he listened to the principal trying to justify his actions. He cut the principal off mid-sentence and said there was a difference between vigilance and paranoia that damages students' reputations. The principal tried to argue that he was following proper protocols for suspicious financial transactions between students. The superintendent asked him to show where in any protocol it said to accuse students of prostitution for sharing lunch money. The principal fumbled through his desk drawers looking for some policy manual that would support his position. Officer Ritter stepped forward and officially stated he was filing no charges and saw no criminal activity whatsoever. He told the principal that if he filed that sexual misconduct report, he'd have to note in his police report that it was completely unsubstantiated. The principal's hand moved back to the form, but Officer Ritter kept talking, explaining how that would create an official record of the principal making false accusations. The superintendent reached over and took the form from the principal's desk, looking at what had been filled out so far. His expression got darker as he read the principal's description of events that twisted everything into something disgusting. He tore the form in half and told the principal they'd handle this as a simple policy violation instead, if anything at all. The principal started to protest, but the superintendent cut him off completely, saying the district wouldn't support him if the families filed defamation lawsuits. The room felt smaller as everyone watched the principal realize his power trip was falling apart in front of his boss. My mom stepped forward and pointed at the superintendent, demanding that this whole thing be wiped from my record since the money thing happened off school property at the loading dock. The superintendent nodded and said he'd check the camera footage to see exactly where we were standing when the exchange happened. My dad pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of everything in the office, including the torn form on the desk. Haley's dad cleared his throat and asked what was going to happen about his daughter not eating lunch for over a week. The superintendent shifted uncomfortably and started to say that was a different issue when Cara Blevins interrupted him. She explained that the school actually had emergency lunch funds available for families in need, but nobody had told them about it. The principal's face got even redder as he realized this information had been kept from students on purpose. The door opened again, and the school counselor walked in carrying a thick folder that she dropped on the superintendent's desk with a loud thud. She opened it and started pulling out page after page of documentation about students going hungry since the money ban started. Her voice shook as she listed name after name of kids who'd been skipping lunch or begging for scraps from friends. She pointed at Haley and said she was just one of dozens who were suffering because of this stupid policy. The superintendent's face went from uncomfortable to angry as he flipped through the pages, seeing dates and names and detailed notes. He looked up at the principal and asked how long he'd known about this hunger problem without doing anything. The principal started to answer, but got cut off by the sound of heels clicking down the hallway getting closer. Gracelyn Conti burst through the door, looking like she'd rushed over from something important based on her business suit and briefcase. She announced herself as a school board member and said she'd been getting calls from parents all morning about some crazy accusation. The superintendent quickly explained the situation while she listened with her arms crossed and her face getting darker with each detail. When he finished, she turned to the principal and asked him point blank if he had any actual evidence besides two kids talking for less than a minute. The principal fumbled with his words trying to explain about suspicious behavior and protecting students, but she wasn't buying it. She pulled out her phone and started recording, saying the board would need to review whether someone with such poor judgment should be running a school. The principal tried to protest, but she held up her hand to stop him and called for someone to bring in the janitor who'd seen us. A few minutes later, the janitor walked in looking confused about being pulled from his work to talk to all these angry people. Officer Ritter asked him what he'd seen at the loading dock that morning, and he shrugged, saying it was just two kids talking for maybe 30 seconds. He added that he sees students meeting there all the time to share homework or snacks, since they can't do it inside anymore. The superintendent asked him if he'd seen anything that looked inappropriate or concerning, and the janitor shook his head. He said it looked like one kid helping another, which used to be normal before all these crazy rules started. The principal jumped in trying to defend himself, saying he was just following safety protocols and protecting students from potential exploitation. The superintendent pulled out a policy manual from his briefcase and slammed it on the desk, asking the principal to show him where it said to accuse kids of prostitution. The principal flipped through pages frantically looking for something to support his actions, but couldn't find anything. The superintendent's voice got louder as he pointed out that nowhere in any protocol did it say to jump to such disgusting conclusions. My mom stepped forward again and demanded the principal write an apology letter for the trauma he'd caused both families with his sick accusations. The principal shook his head at first, saying he'd acted in good faith, but the superintendent cut him off immediately. He told the principal it was either write the apology or face a formal disciplinary review that could end his career. The room went quiet, except for the sound of Haley's quiet crying that had been going on this whole time. Then Haley stood up for the first time since this started, her whole body shaking as she tried to speak. Her voice cracked as she said the principal's words made her feel dirty and ashamed for accepting help when she was starving. She said she'd never felt so humiliated in her life, and now everyone at the school would think she was some kind of prostitute. Her mom started sobbing harder and wrapped her arms around Haley while her dad's hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. He took a step toward the principal, and Officer Ritter had to move between them to prevent something bad from happening. The principal backed up against the wall, looking scared for the first time since this whole mess started. Gracelyn pulled out her phone and started typing fast while telling everyone she was calling an emergency board meeting for tonight about the lunch policy and the principal's conduct. She passed around a notepad, demanding everyone write their contact info because they'd all need to give statements about what happened here. The principal tried to grab the notepad, but she pulled it away and told him he wasn't running the show anymore. Officer Ritter handed his business card to my parents and then to Haley's parents, saying to call him if the school tried any retaliation against us. He turned to the principal and said, false accusations can destroy young people's lives and he should think about that before jumping to sick conclusions again. The principal's face went red, but he didn't say anything back. Theodore Banks pulled out his phone and called someone, then announced that all documentation about this incident would be sealed immediately and not shared with anyone outside this room. He stared right at the principal and said if rumors spread from the administration, there would be serious consequences for whoever leaked them, including termination. The assistant principal, Kara, stepped forward and promised she'd personally make sure both Haley and I could return to class without any harassment from teachers or students. She said she'd email all our teachers right now, saying we were cleared of any wrongdoing, and the matter was completely closed. No questions allowed. The principal sat down at his desk and started writing something on the school letterhead while everyone watched. His hand was shaking as he wrote a short apology admitting he overreacted and misinterpreted the situation based on incomplete information. My mom snatched it from his hand the second he finished, read it, and said it wasn't much, but they'd keep it for their records in case we needed legal action later. The counselor came back into the office and said she'd walk Haley and me out since we'd been through enough today. She put her hand on my shoulder and told me she was proud of me for helping a friend despite the risks, then handed Haley a folder with information about the emergency lunch fund the school had for students in need. She said no student should ever go hungry at this school, and she was sorry the system had failed us so badly. We walked out into the hallway where dozens of students were standing around staring and whispering, obviously having heard rumors about us being called to the office for something serious. I heard someone near the water fountain mention the word prostitution, and my stomach turned, knowing the damage was already spreading through the school despite the superintendent's orders about keeping things quiet. That evening, my parents drove me to the emergency board meeting at the district office, which was packed with angry parents who'd heard about what happened. Parents were standing along the walls because all the seats were taken, and I recognized faces of kids from the school whose parents looked ready to riot. The board listened to testimony from my parents, Haley's parents, and several other parents whose kids had gone hungry because of the money ban. After 2 hours of heated discussion, the board voted to suspend the money-sharing ban immediately and launched a formal investigation into the principal's conduct. The next morning, I got to the school early and noticed the principal's parking spot was empty and his nameplate had been removed from his office door. Kara was sitting at his desk when I walked by, and during morning announcements she said she was serving as acting principal, while the regular principal was on administrative leave. She announced that the lunch-sharing policy had been revised effective immediately, and students could help each other again without fear of punishment. The cafeteria erupted in cheers, and I saw kids already pulling out money to help friends who'd forgotten their lunch that day. But Haley wasn't there to hear it because she didn't come to the school that day, or the next 2 days either. Her mom called my mom and said Haley was too embarrassed to face everyone after what the principal had said about her. They were considering transferring her to Jefferson High across town, but decided that would be letting the principal's false accusations win, like she'd done something wrong when she was just a hungry kid who needed help. When she finally came back 3 days later, she walked into first period with her head down and sat in the back corner instead of her usual seat next to me. I moved to the back and sat down next to her, even though the teacher gave me a look for changing seats. At lunch that day, I made sure to sit with Haley at our usual table, and she actually smiled for the first time in days. Other kids started noticing us sitting together, and a few who I knew had been going hungry started joining our table one by one. By the end of the week, we had 12 kids at our table, all of us understanding what it was like to watch everyone else eat while we went without. Some of them brought extra food from home to share now that the ban was lifted, and we made sure everyone got something. The school board meeting happened that Friday, and my parents told me later that the investigation found the principal had violated multiple policies, including student dignity and due process. They voted to transfer him to administrative duties at the district office, where he wouldn't have any contact with students, while they figured out what to do with him permanently. The following Monday morning, we all got called to the gym for a special assembly where Kara introduced the new interim principal who'd be taking over. She was this younger woman who looked nervous but determined as she stood at the microphone and apologized for what had happened to Haley and me. She promised the school would do better at supporting students in need and said she wanted to hear from us about what changes we needed. That same week, a reporter from the local news station showed up at the school asking questions about the hunger problem and the false accusations. My parents had already told them about what happened without using our names, and other parents had contacted them too. The story ran on the evening news with the headline about students going hungry because of misguided policies and a principal who accused kids of prostitution for sharing lunch money. The district office got flooded with angry calls and emails from people demanding changes to help hungry students. Within 2 weeks, the district announced they were creating a free lunch program for any student who needed it, with no questions asked and no paperwork required. They also started mandatory training for all administrators about appropriate investigation procedures and putting student welfare first, instead of jumping to crazy conclusions. Haley slowly started getting back to normal and even began tutoring kids in math again after school like she used to do before everything happened. She still jumped whenever she got called to the office for anything, even just to pick up a form, but she was getting better. Her mom got a new cleaning contract with the hospital that paid way more than her old clients, and her dad found part-time work at a warehouse. Things were finally looking up for her family after months of struggling. The former principal got permanently reassigned to a desk job at the district office doing paperwork about building maintenance schedules with zero student contact ever again. Some parents thought he got off too easy after what he put us through, but at least he couldn't hurt any other kids with his sick assumptions. 3 months after everything happened, the school held this big student forum where they actually wanted to hear our ideas about policy changes. They eliminated the rule about not sharing supplies, the one about assigned seating at lunch, and a bunch of other stupid rules that made no sense. They promised to run any new policies by the student council first, to make sure they weren't going to cause more problems than they solved. The district invited Haley and me to speak at their annual conference about student advocacy and supporting peers in need. We stood in front of a room full of administrators and teachers and told them our story about how trying to help a hungry friend turned into accusations of prostitution. We explained the difference between suspicious activity and kids just trying to help each other survive bad situations. The administrators took notes and asked questions and seemed to actually care about learning from what happened to us. Some of them came up afterward and apologized for the system that failed us so badly. My parents framed the principal's crappy apology letter and hung it in our kitchen as a reminder to always stand up against false accusations and abuse of power. They told me they were proud of how I handled myself through the whole mess, and that helping Haley showed the kind of person I really was. My dad said most kids would have just looked the other way when their friend was hungry, but I risked my own neck to help her. The new principal started the next semester and immediately set up this buddy system where kids could drop anonymous notes in a box if they saw someone who needed help with food or supplies. She had these forms printed up that just asked what the person needed without asking why they needed it, and within days the box was full of notes about kids who'd been going without lunch for weeks. The school started keeping extra sandwiches and fruit in the nurse's office, where anyone could grab them without questions, and teachers stopped patrolling the cafeteria like prison guards watching for contraband food exchanges. Officer Ritter came back to the school 3 weeks later to give this presentation to the whole student body about the difference between actual warning signs of trouble and adults jumping to crazy conclusions. He stood up there in the auditorium and actually used our case without naming us, explaining how 2 kids meeting for 30 seconds to exchange lunch money got turned into prostitution accusations by an adult with a dirty mind. He showed slides about real warning signs like bruises or fear of going home versus normal teenage behavior, like helping friends or meeting privately to avoid embarrassment. The whole auditorium went silent when he said that false accusations can destroy young lives and that adults in power have a responsibility to investigate properly before making wild claims. Spring came, and Haley got her acceptance letter from State University with a partial scholarship, and she showed me the essay she'd written about overcoming false accusations and poverty stigma that had helped her get it. She wrote about how being accused of selling herself for lunch money had almost broken her, but also taught her about standing up to people who abuse their power. The scholarship committee had apparently been really moved by her story about a friend who risked everything to make sure she didn't go hungry, and how the system tried to punish both of us for basic human kindness. She thanked me in the hallway after getting the letter, saying she never would have made it through that nightmare without knowing someone believed in her innocence. Graduation day arrived in June, and the new principal gave this speech about how the school had learned important lessons about supporting each other and not letting rules get in the way of compassion. She talked about anonymous students who'd shown that helping others was more important than following bad policies, and Haley and I made eye contact across the gym, knowing she meant us. She announced that the school now had a food pantry that any student could access without paperwork or questions, funded by donations from parents who'd been horrified by what happened to us. The district superintendent was there too, and mentioned that they'd added our story to their administrator training program as an example of what happens when officials lose sight of student welfare in favor of control. They called it the lunch money incident in the training materials, showing new principals and assistant principals how paranoid thinking and power trips could turn simple acts of kindness into criminal investigations. The training included Officer Ritter's presentation about proper investigation procedures and the importance of assuming good intentions unless there was real evidence of wrongdoing. They made all the administrators watch a video about our case, though they changed our names and some details to protect our privacy. I started looking at colleges that summer and decided to apply for education or social work programs because watching the system fail, Haley so badly, made me want to help fix it from the inside. I wrote my college essays about how one person trying to help another had exposed massive problems in our school's policies and shown how much damage adults could do with their assumptions. Haley and I stayed close through senior year and into college, bonded forever by surviving that insane week when trying to buy lunch became a criminal investigation. She went on to study law, saying she wanted to defend kids who got railroaded by the system like we almost were. When I think back on everything now, I know I'd help her again even knowing what would happen, because she needed someone to care more about her well-being than about following stupid rules. The principal's sick mind had tried to turn basic human compassion into something dirty and criminal, but we'd proven that helping a hungry friend was never wrong no matter what twisted interpretation someone put on it. His paranoid fantasy about teenage prostitution had destroyed his career, while our simple act of friendship had changed the whole district's approach to student welfare. These days, whenever I see news stories about zero-tolerance policies destroying kids' lives, or administrators on power trips accusing students of crazy things, I remember that week of hell we went through. But I also remember that we won. In the end, because the truth came out, the system got changed, and no student at our school has to go hungry anymore, because we stood up to the injustice. The buddy system is still going strong 5 years later, and they've helped hundreds of kids get food, supplies, and support without anyone getting suspended or accused of crimes for showing basic human decency. Well, that's gonna do it for me today. Appreciate you hanging out and questioning things right along with me. Always feels like a real journey when we share it together. Subscribe for more content like this.